Wrong about my son. That's the hardest thing I've ever had to say out loud, and believe me, I've had to say a lot of hard things in 68 years of living. I was wrong about who he'd become. My name is Roland, and I spent 31 years working for the City of Ottawa infrastructure maintenance, the kind of work that nobody notices until something breaks. My wife, Denise, she used to joke that I kept the whole city running while our own kitchen tap dripped for 3 months. She wasn't wrong. I was better at fixing other people's problems than my own. Denise passed 4 years ago, November, just after the first snow. Pancreatic cancer. She was here, and then she wasn't. And the house on Elgin Street, the one we bought together in 1989 for $212,000, when that was still a stretch, suddenly felt like it had twice as many rooms as before. I kept the house. My daughter Patricia asked me twice if I wanted to sell it and move somewhere smaller, somewhere easier. I told her the same thing both times. The house isn't the problem. The house is fine. I'm fine. And I meant it. I'd paid off the mortgage in 2011, the roof was replaced in 2019, and the bones of that place were solid. More solid than some of the people who'd walk through its door in the years to come. My son Derek was 41 when all of this started. He lived out in Canada with his wife Sherry and their 2 kids. Derek had done well for himself, project manager at a tech firm, decent salary, nice house in a subdivision where every lawn looked the same. I was proud of him. I told him that, maybe not often enough, but I told him. He'd worked hard. He'd built something. What I didn't see, what I refused to see, even when the signs were there, was what the pressure of that life was doing to him. The mortgage on that Canada house was steep. Interest rates had climbed, and his renewal had come at the worst possible time. Sherry's car needed replacing. The kids were heading into hockey and figure skating, and anyone in this country knows what that costs before the first practice is done. Derek needed money. I understood that later. I just didn't understand yet how far he was willing to go to get it. It started small, the way these things always do. He began calling more often, which at first made me genuinely happy. After Denise died, the calls had thinned out. Weeks would pass. I never said anything because I didn't want to be that kind of father, the kind who guilts his children into picking up the phone. But then suddenly Derek was calling every few days, coming by on Sundays, bringing the grandchildren, which was wonderful, taking me for breakfast at a diner on Bank Street, asking how I was feeling, whether the stairs were getting harder, whether I'd thought about what would happen to the house if something happened to me. I told him I felt fine. 68 isn't old. I walked 40 minutes every morning along the Rideau Canal. I cooked my own meals. I managed my own affairs. I had an accountant for my taxes and a lawyer who'd known me since before Derek was born. He nodded and said, "Of course, of course." And then the next visit he'd find a slightly different way to ask the same question. "Have you looked into any of those retirement communities out in the West End?" A friend of his had moved his father into one in Nepean. Apparently it was lovely, very active. They had woodworking and card nights. I said I had a woodworking bench in my own basement and I could play cards whenever I liked. He laughed like I'd made a joke, but his eyes weren't laughing. Then came the afternoon he sat across from me at my own kitchen table, wrapped his hands around a mug of coffee I'd made him, and told me I should think about what the house could do for my retirement. "You're sitting on over $1 million, Dad," he said. That was probably true. The market had done remarkable things to old houses on Elgin Street. You could sell, invest the equity, live very comfortably. You wouldn't have to worry about maintenance, property tax, any of it. I looked at him for a long moment. "I don't worry about any of it now," I said. He shifted in his chair. "You're not going to live forever." "No," I agreed. "I'm not." There was a silence between us that lasted longer than it should have between a father and a son. "I just want you to be taken care of," he said. I told him I appreciated that. I meant it too, even then, even as something quiet and cold was settling at the base of my stomach. The same feeling I used to get when I was inspecting a section of road, and the surface looked fine, but something underneath didn't feel right. You learn, after enough years, to trust that feeling. I didn't say anything to Patricia yet. She lived in Halifax with her husband and worked as a nurse, the kind of person who notices things, who asks the right questions. Part of me didn't want to worry her. Another part wasn't ready to say out loud what I was beginning to suspect about her brother. The calls from Derek kept coming, the visits continued, And slowly, carefully, the conversation shifted. He started mentioning a financial advisor he trusted, someone who specialized in estate planning for seniors. He used the word seniors casually, like it didn't mean anything, like it was just a category. He mentioned that he'd looked into power of attorney, just for peace of mind, just so that if anything ever happened suddenly, someone he trusted could manage my affairs without the courts getting involved. He said someone he trusted and looked at me in a way that made it clear he meant himself. I asked him once directly, "Derek, are you in some kind of financial trouble?" He looked offended. He said absolutely not. He said he was doing fine. Everything was fine. This was just about making sure I was protected. I said okay. I let it go. But that night I called my lawyer, James Kowalczyk, who had been handling my family's affairs for going on 20 years. I didn't give him details. I just asked him to remind me of the process for updating my will and my property designations. James, who was not a man who asked unnecessary questions, told me to come in the following Tuesday. I said I'd be there. What I did over the next 2 weeks I did quietly. I didn't tell Derek. I didn't tell anyone except James and eventually Patricia. I updated my will. I added Patricia as joint owner on the house, not because I thought I was dying, but because I wanted the paperwork to reflect what I actually wanted, which was that the house would go to both my children equally, handled by Patricia, who I trusted to be clear-headed about it. I added her name to my primary bank account as a signatory. I moved the contents of my home safe documents, bonds, a collection of old coins that had belonged to my own father, and several personal letters I'd written and never sent into a safety deposit box at my branch on Spark Street, under my name and Patricia's. My home safe, after all of this, contained one thing: a letter. I'll come back to that. 3 weeks later, Derek called and said he wanted to bring Sherry and the kids over for Sunday dinner. He said he had something he wanted to discuss, that he'd been talking to a lawyer, not James, a different one about a few options for my long-term planning, and he thought we should all sit down together. I said that sounded fine. I made a roast. I was glad to see my grandchildren. Sherry was warm and easy, the way she always was, and I wondered sometimes how much she actually knew about what Derek was trying to do and how much she'd simply told herself was none of her concern. After dinner, when the kids had gone to the living room with their devices, Derek set a folder on the table. Inside were forms, a continuing power of attorney for property, and a personal care directive, both naming Derek as my attorney. He explained it the way a person explains something to someone they've decided is not quite capable of making their own decisions. Slowly, with a lot of the same phrases repeated. He said it was just a precaution. He said it was standard. He said Sherry's parents had done the same thing years ago, and it had made everything so much easier. He said the word easier at least 4 times. I looked at the forms. I looked at him. I said I would have James review them before I signed anything. Derek said that was fine. Of course, take all the time I needed. He just wanted them on my radar. He was so reasonable about it. So patient. That was the thing that I kept turning over afterward, how patient he was. Like a man who already knew the outcome. About a week after that dinner, I noticed something. I kept a spare key to the house in a small ceramic bowl on the shelf in my front hall. I'd always kept a spare there. It was muscle memory, 40 years of habit. Derek knew about that key because he'd used it once, years ago, when Denise and I were in Muskoka, and a pipe had burst in the basement, and he'd come to shut off the water. He'd been my hero that weekend. The key was slightly out of place in the bowl, just turned a little differently than I left it. Maybe nothing, but I am a man who spent 31 years checking whether things were as they should be. I said nothing. I bought a small security camera, the kind you can get at Canadian Tire for $60, and I installed it inside the shelf above the bowl, pointing down. Derek didn't know about the camera. I angled it so it covered the hall and the kitchen entrance. Then I waited. I also moved the ceramic bowl closer to the edge of the shelf, where it could be seen from the front window if someone were standing on the porch and looking in. I am not proud of what I'm about to tell you, but I am not ashamed of it either. I started pretending. Not all at once, not dramatically, just small things, carefully placed. When Derek came by, I let myself seem more tired than I was. I repeated a sentence once or twice, like I'd forgotten I'd already said it. I mentioned that I'd had a hard time finding my glasses that morning, that I couldn't remember if I'd taken my blood pressure medication. His eyes changed when I said these things. There was something in them that I'm still working on forgiving. He started staying longer during visits. He started looking around the house in a way that I recognized the look of someone doing an inventory. He asked once if I still kept important documents in the study. I said yes, in the safe. He asked if the combination was somewhere written down in case I forgot it. I said I had a system, then changed the subject. The camera recorded him 3 times. The first time was a Thursday afternoon when I'd gone for my walk. He let himself in with the spare key, which confirmed that he had made a copy. The key was kept in my possession when I was home. He went to my study. He was in there for 7 minutes. He didn't find what he was looking for because I'd already removed it, but he looked. The second time, he came with a clipboard and stood in different rooms in the house taking photographs on his phone. I saw this on the recording and understood he was getting the house assessed. Without asking me, without telling me, the third time was the one that mattered. He came on a Saturday morning, early, when he knew I sometimes slept in. He didn't knock. He used his key to come through the front door, and I was sitting in the kitchen in the dark, at the table, with a cup of tea in my hands. He walked into the kitchen and stopped when he saw me. We looked at each other for a moment. "Dad," he said, "I didn't think you'd be up." "I live here," I said. He laughed, awkward, and said he'd forgotten something on his last visit, was just popping by. I told him I hadn't found anything. He said maybe it was in the study. Could he check? I told him to go ahead. He came out of the study a few minutes later. He'd found the safe. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and he said, almost too carefully, "Dad, do you remember telling me once that you kept the combination on a piece of paper in the top drawer of your desk? You said it was, in case you ever forgot." I had never said that. Not once. Not ever. "Did I?" I said. "I don't remember that." He nodded slowly. Said he was sure I had. Said he was only asking because he wanted to make sure, if anything ever happened, he'd be able to access important documents quickly. He said this while looking at me with that patient, careful expression. "Go ahead and look," I said. "Top drawer." He opened it. Inside the top drawer there was indeed a small piece of paper. On the paper I had written a combination. It was the combination to a lock I had bought at Canadian Tire, the same day as the camera, and that lock was now on the old safe. Inside the old safe was the letter I mentioned earlier. He opened the safe. I heard the sound from the kitchen. I heard nothing for about 30 seconds. Then I heard him walk back to the kitchen doorway, and he stood there holding the letter. I had written it in the weeks after I first began to understand what was happening. I'd thought carefully about every word. It was addressed to him by name, and it said, among other things, the following: that I loved him, that I had always loved him and I always would, that I knew what he'd been doing and I needed him to understand that I knew not to punish him, but because a parent who pretends not to see a child making a terrible mistake is not a loving parent, just a comfortable one, that the house was no longer solely in my name, that my accounts were no longer solely in my name, that I had kept detailed records, including the camera footage, which James Kowalczyk was holding, and which would be relevant if any attempt were made to challenge my capacity or contest my estate, that I was not confused, not declining, not a problem to be managed, that I was his father, and at the end, I told him that the door was still open, that I wasn't asking him to be perfect, I was asking him to be honest. He read the whole thing standing in the doorway. I watched him. When he finished, he set it down on the counter. He didn't say anything right away. He pulled out a kitchen chair and sat across from me the way he used to when he was a teenager and knew he'd done something he couldn't talk his way out of. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough," I said. He put his face in his hands. He was quiet for a while. Then he told me about the mortgage renewal, about how far behind they were, about how he'd told himself it wasn't really hurting me, that I had more than I needed, that he was going to pay it back somehow, that it wasn't really stealing, it was just, and he stopped himself before he finished that sentence. I didn't fill the silence. I let him sit in it. Eventually, he asked what I was going to do. I told him I wasn't going to do anything I didn't have to, that I wasn't calling the police, that I wasn't writing him out of my life, but that I would not be signing anything, and that if he or anyone else tried to have me declared incompetent, James had everything he needed. I told him that the house, when the time came, would go to him and his sister equally, as it always had been my intention, but that Patricia would handle the estate because she had not spent the last several months treating her father like an inconvenient administrative problem. He nodded. He said he understood. "I need you to be more honest with me, Derek," I said, "about what's actually going on in your life. Not because I can always fix it, but because I'm your father, and I want to know." He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't think you'd want to hear it." That broke something open in me that I hadn't known was closed, because I think he believed that. I think somewhere in the story he'd told himself, I had become the house and the money and the obstacle, and not the man who had driven him to hockey practice at 5 in the morning for 11 winters without once complaining. I told him I always wanted to hear it. We sat in that kitchen for another 2 hours. He told me things he probably hadn't told Sherry. About the pressure, about the shame of struggling when it looked to everyone outside like he had everything, about how much of his identity was wrapped up in being the one who didn't need help. I told him about the years I'd worried about money too, when he and Patricia were young and the city had done layoffs and I'd lain awake next to Denise doing the math in my head over and over. He said he didn't know that. I said there was a lot he didn't know. That was my fault too. By the time he left, nothing was fixed. It doesn't work that way. But something had shifted. He looked like my son again, in a way he hadn't for several months. I called Patricia that evening and told her most of it. Not all of it. She would be angry with Derek for a while, and that was fair. And eventually, she wouldn't be. She's a nurse. She understands that people sometimes cause harm when they're frightened and call it problem solving. I'm still in the house on Elgin Street. I still walk the canal most mornings. I still make my own meals. The spare key is back in the ceramic bowl, and I leave it exactly as I leave it, and I notice every morning whether it's been moved. It hasn't been. Derek and his family still come for Sunday dinner when their schedule allows. Things are careful between us now. The way things are when you've seen something in a person that you can't unsee, but you've made the decision to stay anyway. I think that's what forgiveness actually is, not forgetting, not pretending, but deciding to remain present for someone even when you know exactly what they're capable of. Sherry asked me once, a few months after all of it, whether I had always known Derek might do something like this. I thought about it seriously before I answered. I said no. I said that the people who love us are the ones who can still surprise us, in both directions. She nodded like she understood more than I'd said. My grandchildren are growing up fast. The older one, Marcus named after nobody in particular as far as I can tell, just a name they liked, he started asking me questions about the old days. What Ottawa was like in the 70s. What his grandmother was like. Whether I was ever scared of anything. I told him I was scared of plenty of things. I told him the trick was not to let what scared you make you stop paying attention. That the most important skill a person can have is noticing when something's not right, even before they can put a name to it. Especially then. He seemed to think about that. He asked if that was something you could learn. I told him it was something you practiced. He said he wanted to practice it. I told him good. I told him I'd help. Some things you can pass down, and some things you can only show someone by example. I hope what he saw in me, during those months when I was moving quiet and watching careful, was not a man at war with his own family. I hope what he saw was a man who refused to become someone else's footnote, who believed that dignity isn't something you lose just because someone decides you've gotten old enough to be managed. The house is still mine. So is everything in it. So is the story. And the story, as it turns out, had a better ending than I expected.